Exorcisms. Thought by many to be just as much a myth as the ghouls, gargs, demons, and devils they take their aim at. Yet, unfortunately, history has proven time and time again that this dark practice simply will not die, often at the expense of the mentally ill. That's what happened on the 1st of July 1976 in Klingenberg am Main in Bavaria, where Anelise Michel, the 23-year-old who had been suffering from severe mental illness for several years, passed away. On that day, a pair of priests marched into the town at the invitation of her parents and put her through such an ordeal that each of those priests and her parents would later be found guilty of her murder. This is the story of Anelise Michel and how the church murdered her. Now, since the beginning of time, Satan has been locked in a never-ending war with the human race, sending his servants and sometimes himself to possess people, ruin their lives, and drive them to the greatest acts of evil. It is in response to these possessions that bishops are empowered by the Catholic Church to send priests all across the planet to combat the evil spirits, fallen angels, and Satan himself wherever they appear. At least, that's the version of events the Roman Catholic Church will tell you. A historian would instead tell you that the practice of exorcism is best understood as a practice through which one individual believes they are expelling an evil spirit from another. Exorcisms have historically almost entirely been carried out on those suffering from severe mental illnesses, and have often included days-long assaults on individuals in a supposed attempt to cure them of their ailments. The first recorded exorcisms can be found in the New Testament of the Bible, but beyond that, we have no independently confirmable record of exorcisms until the early 16th century. Back then, Europe was in turmoil. The church had been meddling in the affairs of states across the continent for centuries, and people were getting pretty fed up. To make matters worse, there were whispers of a new plague spreading across the land. Poverty was at an all-time high, and the dark spectre of war was threatening to return to the continent. It would be into this quagmire that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg and sparked the Protestant Reformation. Over the next decade, Luther would go about modernizing the canons of Protestantism, codifying them so even the common folk could understand the rules of his new church. And it's here, in 1524, that we find the first records of a modern exorcism ritual, since Luther had written a procedure for exorcising babies which involved dunking their heads into holy water for extended periods to stop them from crying. Yes, and don't try that at home. So we know from the writings of Luther that the Catholic Church had similar procedures at the time, though we don't know what form those procedures took, as all independently verifiable records of Catholic exorcisms from this period have been lost to history. Either way, though, the beginning of time is more likely a maximum of 2,000 years ago and a minimum of the last 600 years. Not that that mattered, because with the birth of Protestantism, a new plague entered the land. The plague of witches and demonic possession. Social historians still debate to this day what the hell was in the drinking water in the 16th and 17th centuries, but what we do know is that over that period we saw a resurgence of witch trials and claims of demonic possession in numbers not seen since the depths of the Dark Ages. In the records of the ecclesiastical courts of England and Wales, we even find several canons requesting priests to show more leniency with afflicted witches so that the church would stop being so inundated with cases. This inundation eventually led to a major change in the ordained canons of the church itself. By 1614, several complaints had been made to the Holy See about the outdated exorcism ritual, and again, we don't know what this ritual included, but we know that people in the 17th century were complaining it was outdated, so it's fair to say it probably was. These complaints reached such a level that they were brought to the attention of Pope Paul V, and he declared that a new ritual of exorcism was required. Now, this is probably the bit where you're expecting me to continue speaking about the evolution of the ritual of exorcism all the way up to the 20th century. But, well, no. You see, the 1614 exorcism ritual was deemed to be such an absolute banger by the priests that they never changed it, even until today. In 1999, there was a small revision, and in 2013, an alternative exorcism was published, but the 1614 exorcism ritual is still not only accepted canon of the Roman Catholic Church, but it is even endorsed by several Catholic national organizations across the globe. So, what happens when it's time for an exorcism? The ritual sets out that if a priest suspects that an exorcism is required, he should turn his attention to the recorded exorcism cases from the past, since the church keeps a central registry of previous cases and a small library of approved authors on exorcism for priests to consider. If the priest is still of the opinion, after consulting this literature, that the individual he wishes to exorcise is possessed by evil spirits, then he must reach out to his nearest bishop, who must in turn inform the local diocese and seek guidance. From there, the ritual requires that the priest, while awaiting a response, should approach the possessed, who from here on out is referred to as a patient. The priest is then required to ask the patient's permission to exorcise them, though the ritual expressly states that permission is not required, as it's only required that they ask. By this point, the ritual requires that the bishop above the priest either grant the priest permission to perform an exorcism or provide a reason why one can't be performed. From there, the priest is required to ask the patient to exalt God and give penance for their sins, and if possible, they should be taken to a church or other holy ground. Frequently, the priest will be required to read verses from the Bible, spray the patient with holy water and blessed salts, present a crucifix to the patient, and force the patient to hold what are referred to as relics of the saints, of which the church has actually approved a list of items ranging from body parts to excretions and possessions that the saints held in high regards during their lifetimes. From there, the ritual simply requires the priest to repeat the process until the evil spirit has left the patient. Now, at this point, you're probably asking how somebody could have died from this, and how could anyone say that an exorcism is dangerous? Well, there are a few subsidiary notes on exorcisms. First, the ritual states that it is not required to force the patient to fast from food and water, but doing so can actually often expedite the process of removing the spirit. Second, the ritual does not at any point state to attack the patient, but it does say that the patient must be held in one location for the full duration of the ritual. We know from recorded cases that when patients try to leave locations, it is often an acceptable practice for priests to hold that patient down or otherwise physically force them to remain. A small note in fairness to the church, though, the ritual also states to not perform it to those who are mentally ill. However, such a term was only added in 1999 in a revision to the ritual. It should also be noted that the 2013 ritual has amended the process slightly to modernize it, although it still endorses the idea of encouraging the patient to fast and holding them in one location. Theoretically, exorcisms break many laws in pretty much every country on the planet. Yet according to recent data from religious think tanks in the UK and the USA, they're actually on the rise. Now, the ritual we just talked about is the Roman Catholic ritual, which is the most common, but exorcism rituals are observed in almost every religion ranging from Buddhism to Mormonism. In fact, exorcisms have been estimated by societal historians to be more prevalent today than they ever were in the Middle Ages. And it's for that reason we tell you today the story of Anelise Michel. Now, most of what we know about Anelise Michel's case isn't certain, since a lot of the facts had to be determined at trial after she had died, and record keeping and sharing is not exactly a speciality of the Catholic Church. Anelise was born on the 21st of September 1952 in Liebfing in Bavaria in West Germany. She was born to Joseph Michel and Anna Michel, two deeply religious parents who took her to Mass twice every week for the first 16 years of her life. At trial, her parents noted that she was troubled from a young age and was diagnosed with epileptic psychosis after she experienced severe convulsions somewhere around her 16th birthday. Epileptic psychosis is generally caused by temporal lobe epilepsy, the most common form of epilepsy. It involves seizures occurring frequently in localized areas of the brain. A seizure is a situation where one area of the brain is overwhelmed with signals to the point where it ceases to function. We don't know what exactly causes epileptic psychosis and why it's different from other forms of temporal lobe epilepsy, but we believe that it's caused when a certain part of the brain receives a consistent electrical signal all of the time, rather than just when in seizure. It can often cause people to have delusions ranging from hearing and seeing things that aren't real to completely disassociating from reality and living in their own, often terrifying worlds. Anelise's epileptic psychosis caused her to hear voices and become deeply intolerant of religious objects, something that greatly irked and worried her religious parents. By the age of 20, she would also be diagnosed with severe depression and was committed to a psychiatric hospital where she would undergo treatment ranging from electrostatic shock therapy to cocktails of various drugs that would knock her out for days at a time. After spending 6 months in the psychiatric hospital, her doctors concluded that she was no longer a severe danger to herself, and they discharged her to her family, putting her on a treatment plan that encouraged the continued use of extremely strong depressants in the hope of providing some help to her situation. Unfortunately, those drugs would have no effect, and before long, Anelise and her parents would all conclude that she was possessed by a demon. In 1973, Anelise's condition began to worsen, and she began growling, drinking her urine, and eating bugs, which sparked her parents to reach out to several local priests to request an exorcism. Every priest that they reached out to turned them away and told them that they needed to continue psychiatric treatment, but this didn't dissuade them. In 1975, Anelise sent a letter to priest Ernst Alt, who would later claim that Anelise didn't look like an epileptic, and he would in turn reach out to Bishop Joseph Stangl to approve the exorcism. In response to this request, Stangl instructed Alt to perform an exorcism contrary to the 1614 ritual, but ordered that such be done in total and complete secrecy. On the 24th of September 1975, priest Ernst Alt and priest Arnold Renz arrived at the Michel household to begin their first session. They would meet a total of 67 times, approximately once every 1.5 weeks over 10 months. At the request of Anelise, her parents would stop consulting and taking her to doctors sometime after the 10th session. Renz would later testify that within these sessions, Anelise would often speak about the need to die for the wayward youth of the day and apostate priests of the modern church, and how in the final weeks, Anelise would completely refuse food. This refusal of food later became a key point in contention, with prosecutors arguing that the priests had instructed Anelise to refuse food, and the priests claiming that Anelise had simply chosen to refuse it of her own will. Either way, on the 1st of July 1976, Anelise Michel passed away in her home. An autopsy would rule that the cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration resulting from almost a year of near starvation. At the time of her death, her kneecaps were broken from the protestation required by the priests. She was unable to move without the assistance of others, and she had contracted pneumonia and weighed only 30 kilograms. For context, that's the same weight as the average mattress of a single bed. The autopsy also ruled that Anelise's death was preventable up to a week before she died, and that had medical attention been sought at that time, she would have had a 99% chance of survival. A few months after Anelise's death, her parents and the two priests were charged with negligent homicide for her death. At trial, the parents were defended by famed defense lawyer Erich Schmidt-Leichner, who had been one of the defense lawyers at the Nuremberg trials. Consequently, the state never requested a jail sentence for anybody involved and instead requested a fine for the priests and no sentence for the parents because they had suffered enough, which is a recognizable legal defense to sentencing under the German Penal Code. Over the next 2 years, the public geared up for the trial, and interest sparked as to what happened in the exorcisms. Several media organizations reached out to the church for comment on several occasions, and they simply said that Anelise's death was tragic, but that the priests had done nothing wrong and had acted in accordance with their official doctrine. Finally, on the 30th of March 1978, the trial would commence. Doctors would be called to give testimony to Anelise's mental state and asked several times whether they could be certain that Anelise was not possessed. Doctors repeatedly informed the court that not only were they certain that Anelise was not possessed, but that it was their collective opinion that Anelise had religious delusions related to her psychosis due to her family's deeply religious nature. Doctors who had been consulted during Anelise's exorcisms also testified as to how they had told both Anelise and her parents there is no injection against the devil, and they believed that she was in the midst of a most serious psychotic episode and needed urgent care. Schmidt-Leichner addressed two primary arguments in the defense of the parents and by extension the priests. First, he argued that exorcism was not only legal under the German Penal Code, but that the German constitution's provision for the protection of unrestricted exercise of religious belief protected the defendants from any form of liability. Leichner also argued that, as Anelise herself had stated the intent to refuse medical treatment, it was not the responsibility of her parents that she had not been treated. Separate lawyers for the priests argued that Anelise had been possessed by real demons, and in court they played audio recording of the exorcism sessions which supposedly showed demons arguing. Throughout the trial, demons were identified by the priests as Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Belial, Legion, Hitler, and Nero. The priests even went so far as to argue that their exorcism had been successful, as Anelise had supposedly been freed from her demons shortly before her death. Bishop Stangl, the man who had approved the entire affair, was never called upon to testify in court, nor was he ever dragged before one as a defendant. While the trial was ongoing, he did give an interview, though, and claimed to have not been informed by the priests of any ongoing mental or psychiatric condition, and claimed that had he been aware of Anelise's psychiatric state, he would have not authorized an exorcism. When asked as to why he had demanded total secrecy for the exorcism and why he had not inquired as to Anelise's mental state, he refused to answer. The judge in the case found all defendants guilty and disregarded the request of the prosecutor, sentencing them all to various lengths of suspended sentences, meaning none would ever see a day in jail for the death of Anelise. Furthermore, the judge ruled that due to Anelise's actions, civil action could not be brought against the church, but that the church was directly responsible for the death of Anelise Michel. Now, the trial brought a slew of attention to the church's practices surrounding exorcism, and a myriad of criticisms of how the church handled the situation began to flow in. Chief among these criticisms was the fact that even after the trial, the church's official stance was that Anelise had indeed been possessed by a demon and that its priests had saved her. This being a position that did not change until 2013, a full 37 years after her death at the hands of two of their priests, and despite that change, even to today, no official apology has ever been given by the church. Pope Benedict XVI instructed German bishops to decrease the use of exorcism following the ordeal, even though Benedict is well known to have been a supporter of wider usage of exorcisms in many other countries. Furthermore, the grave of Anelise became a pilgrimage site for primarily Catholics who had seen her as a symbol due to the belief that she atoned for wayward priests and sinful youths. It is on similar lines that when the house she died in was burned down in 2013, many locals and followers of what had happened came to the conclusion that the fire had been the result of an exorcism, despite the official police report claiming that it was a suspected case of arson. Finally, time and time again, historians and sociologists have attempted to understand what sparked people's interests in exorcisms. It is from these studies that we know that for the most part, exorcisms were dying out as a phenomenon before 1973, when the famed film The Exorcist was released. We also know that movies like The Exorcist have sparked a renewed drive for exorcisms in many communities across the world in recent years. And on behalf of everyone here at Into the Shadows, if you're considering seeking an exorcism for yourself or someone else, please don't. 9 times out of 10, whatever you're suffering from can be helped by doctors and medicine alone. So please, seek help and stay safe.